knowledge of the situation that's being lampooned. So all this highly participatory shift in how information is processed and organized was what McLuhan wrote about in his books in the 1960s and 70s. And he was sensitive to that and how mythology functions in these environments. So he's one of my favorite thinkers.
Well, Leonard Shlain, I know you've also quote him, and he was one of my favorite interviews because he's saying he's just filling in after McLuhan what's happening now with the advent of the computer and even to typing with both hands and all the images that we can now see as we read.
Yeah, Shlain he's a wonderful sequel to McLuhan. He's one of my favorites too. I really enjoyed The Alphabet versus the Goddess, and he has this wonderful idea that he sort of reverses the traditional presuppositions of the curriculum by saying, well, actually, it's literacy that creates misogyny, and the more literate a society is, the more misogynistic it gets.
Due to left brain dominance.
Exactly. The left brain is wired into the right hand, and the right hand is the one that usually holds the weapon. And if you go back through the history of art, you can go all the way back to Egypt. It's always the right hand that's holding the weapon. Always, always, always. So the moment that the right hand throws the weapon, and it's the left hand that usually holds the infant. If you look back at the earlier images of the Madonna, and I'm talking about Isis and Horus here, the very earliest Madonna images. The child is always being held in the left arm until you get up to about the 14th, 15th century when in Western Europe depth perspective is being worked out in painting and a new space conception is coming into being, a three-dimensional space conception that is similar to the Gutenbergian idea of linear sequential space in which everything is arranged visually by the eye, which scans things from left to right and organizes objects in a three-dimensional Cartesian phase space. And right at that time, if you look at the art, in Renaissance art, you'll notice that the Madonna is holding the Christ child in her right arm at that time. It's a totally unconscious thing that happens, but these forces do work themselves out in society unconsciously, so it's wonderful the way it works. And then also at that time, this is the same time that when the printing press is invented in the middle of the 15th century, right about 1453, within about 50, 60 years or so, the witch hunts in Europe start building up, and they really reach a climax in the 17th century, right when literacy is really beginning to heat up, and the first, grade schools are being invented, and they're coming in and changing the idea of what it means to be a child. In the Middle Ages, a child was somebody who was just a miniature adult, and there was no fundamental distinction between a child and an adult until, these schools came along with the idea that it's really literacy that demarcates the child from the adult. And so now we're losing that distinction again as we get rid of the distinction with electronic culture between what makes a child distinct from an adult. And so that distinction is lost with the meltdown of literacy, and consequently you get these television programs, like Cheers, and in which characters like Frasier are ridiculed. I mean, it's the only kind of intellectual you ever find on television is somebody who's ridiculed. And, the adults are never shown on television in these sitcoms making literate references. You have to go back to the old movies to find that. So all these things happen in the Renaissance, this total reconfiguration of society into a three-dimensional Gutenbergian phase space, a perspectival space that then is melted down in the 19th century. And you can first see it in the 19th century in art, like Shlain says in his first book, Art and Physics. If you look at the paintings of Manet in the 1860s, he's the first to start, particularly with that painting of his, the Déjeuner sur l'herbe, Breakfast on the Grass, you can see him getting rid of the laws of perspective because the figures aren't represented as perspectively correct in that painting. And then he eliminates the horizon line, in these paintings of, boats at sea where it's almost like a camera eye and you can't see the horizon, and it becomes very disorienting. So Manet starts melting this down at about the same time that the telegraph comes in and starts beaming information at light speed and melting down this old idea that information is processed through reading from left to right sequentially. And so as you look through the course of the 20th century, the image becomes more and more predominant. You can do this in a simple way if you want to do an experiment by going back and looking at the earliest ads in advertising in magazines like Time magazine. If you look in the Time magazine in the 1920s and you look at how advertising is represented there, you have to read the ads. You find a picture, but there's always a paragraph under the picture that presupposes that the audience is literate enough to sit down and take the time to read the little story that they've written under the ad. That's gone now. That idea of reading an ad is gone, and the image has totally taken over. So it's all iconic, right brain pattern recognition, and it's instantaneous. It's all this subliminal information, and advertisers figured this out, and they figured out how to manipulate audiences with the use of mythic images. So that's McLuhan and Schlein and all that.
Oh, boy. That tells us a lot, doesn't it? I've got to go back to what you said about children. How could a society view a child, a toddler, as a miniature adult? They can't function. They can't think like an adult. They can't. I mean, I know that there were not early childhood laws protecting children from working, and they were trying to send children in the lower classes off to work like an adult. But how does a society mistake a child for an adult? What do you mean by that?
Here's a question for you that will answer that instantaneously. Do you know the famous story about the Grail quester, the novel Parzival? When you think in your mind of Parzival going in quest of the Grail, how old do you think he is roughly?
I would say a young man, say 20.
He's actually 15. He's a 15-year-old kid. But yeah, we tend to think of him as 20, 25, something like that. He seems like a pretty full-grown adult. And people married clear up until the 19th century at very, very young ages.
Like 13?
Remember Poe marrying his 13-year-old cousin and all of that. I mean, this was something that took a very long time to develop. Also in the Middle Ages, you have the Children's Crusade, where the children all line up and they all do this impossible task of going across Europe, and of course they all died. But the fact that the society would, there's all the children going off on crusade. Let's see what happens to them. They're regarded as miniature adults.
That they didn't think that it was their job to protect children until the age in which they could, we call it legal 18 or 21, that they thought children could go off and take care of themselves. Is that your point?
More or less, and they were expected, to do all the same drudgery and chores and housework, that their adults were doing from a very, very ridiculously early age. This is why our modern sensibility has a hard time accepting that. Clear up until the 19th century, children were still working in factories. I mean, we still don't, that seems incredible to us. But really, the idea that 21 is the age of maturity, that was a creation of the 18th century. And the founding fathers, and that whole idea that 21 is the age at which you're capable of thinking rationally and making enlightened choices and decisions. That's really a vogue that came about in the Enlightenment. But it was a development of reading and literacy and the development of schools. And the schools first started in the very late 16th century, grade schools. And it took a while for them. It's not really up until the 20th century that they really become a common assumption that your children, of course, would go to public school. That would be of course, not until the 20th century. Wow. Even that took a long time.
Well,
But electronic culture is melting all that down, all those distinctions. This, by the way, this is from Neil Postman that I'm running this theory by you. It's from his book, The Disappearance of Childhood. This is where he talks about that. He's a kind of like Schlein. He's a McLuhan protege also.
Oh, that's worthy of another conversation because I just can't even fathom what you're talking about. I mean, I'd have to really look at that and examine that. It's often quoted that they way back then, were tossing babies like a game. Now that's hard to fathom too, that they could think that it would be okay to toss a baby like a ball. Was that really true?
That I don't know. Okay. I've heard that. But I can't say.
I don't know if it's apocryphal or what.
Okay. Yeah.
Now, thank you. You've really laid a great background in which to understand. One other quick question. So you're saying that the eye actually scans from left to right, and that's why we have formatted our books to scan from left to right. What about the